2:14, the ER doors didn't just open, they exploded. A dying Navy SEAL on the stretcher, a K-9 with teeth bared at every doctor's throat, and a rookie nurse who shouldn't even be in the room. But when she whispers a code that officially doesn't exist, the beast bows. Stay tuned, because this isn't just a rescue, it's a resurrection. The clock on the wall of Chicago General ticked toward 2:14 a.m. The air was heavy with the smell of antiseptic and exhaustion. Then, the silence was shattered. The double doors of the emergency room slammed open with a violence that shook the glass. Soldiers in scorched fatigues burst through first, their boots hammering a frantic rhythm against the tile. Behind them, a stretcher came flying in so fast it nearly clipped the frame. On that gurney lay Jackson Thorne, a Navy SEAL whose uniform was shredded, blood soaking through field bandages applied in a desperate hurry. His face was a mask of pale, clenched agony. But the doctors didn't look at Thorne first. They couldn't. Matching the stretcher's frantic pace was a beast of muscle and fur, a Belgian Malinois named Havoc. His ears were pinned, his hackles raised like a row of jagged glass. He wasn't just a dog, he was a weapon in a state of total combat readiness. "Get that animal out of here," a surgeon barked. Security moved in, weapons were drawn. The K-9 didn't flinch. He let out a growl that felt like a vibration in the floorboards, low, deep, and lethal. He wasn't panicking, he was guarding. "If he bites, we put him down," an officer yelled, his finger tightening on the trigger. That was when Alina, a rookie nurse in plain blue scrubs, stepped forward. She didn't shout, she didn't run, she knelt. Keeping her body low, she leaned toward Havoc's ear and whispered 6 words, a unit code so precise it felt like a ghost had entered the room. The K-9 froze, the growl died in his throat. He sat, then gently lowered his head against Thorne's bloodied chest. The room went deathly silent. "Go," Alina said, her voice like cold steel. "He'll let you work now." As the surgeons rushed Thorne toward the trauma bay, one question hung in the air. Who is this nurse? The trauma bay was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Monitors screamed, cords snapped taut. Jackson Thorne's vitals were a jagged line of failure. Alina stood against the wall, her hands clasped, her eyes tracking every move of the scalpel with a discipline that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. "What did you say to that dog?" the lead surgeon demanded as he clamped an artery. "Something they don't teach in medical school," Alina replied, her voice hauntingly calm. Suddenly the monitor flatlined, arrhythmia, charged to 200, clear. The paddles hit Thorne's chest, his body jolted. Havoc, still at the foot of the bed, flinched but never broke his sit-stay. "Again. Nothing." Then Havoc let out a soft, sharp whine. He nudged Thorne's left side. Alina's eyes sharpened. "Left side," she commanded. "He's bleeding internally. You're missing the pocket." The surgeon hesitated, then checked. She was right. They saved him by a fraction of an inch. As Thorne was wheeled toward recovery, Alina watched from the shadows. She thought she was safe. She thought the past stayed buried. But then, a deep, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the hospital windows. It wasn't a life flight. It was a Navy Seahawk landing without clearance on the roof. Alina's jaw tightened. She knew that sound, and she knew that the men stepping off that helicopter weren't here for the wounded SEAL. They were here for her. 4 men stepped out of the elevator. They wore no insignia, but they carried the weight of the Pentagon in their stride. The leader, Commander Miller, stopped the moment he saw Havoc. "Where is she?" Miller asked. The charge nurse pointed toward the station. Alina didn't look up from her charts, but she felt the air change. Miller walked until his boots were inches from her. For a long moment, the world stopped. Then slowly, the commander snapped to attention. He gave Alina a full, hard Navy SEAL salute, the kind reserved for legends. The ER staff gasped. Nurses dropped their clipboards. "Commander," Alina said quietly, returning the salute with perfect form. "Ma'am," Miller's voice cracked, "I didn't know you were alive. The world thinks you died in the desert." They moved to a private room. The door shut, leaving Havoc to guard the entrance like a gargoyle. How? Miller asked. Night op, Gulf perimeter, Elena began, her voice distant. No air cover, we were ghosts. 1/3 of the confirmed kills in that sector were mine. She described the fire, the betrayal, and the explosion that threw her clear while her unit was wiped out. She had crawled through the sand, injured enough to look like a corpse, until the extraction teams passed her by. You think it was an inside job, Miller whispered. I know it was, Elena replied. The Admiral gave me a choice, testimony and a target on my back, or a clean slate. And you chose to be a nurse, Miller said, looking at her scrubs. I chose to save lives instead of taking them, she said. It felt like balance. The trauma bay was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The high-pitched whine of the heart monitor sliced through the air, a frantic rhythm that signaled a life slipping away. Doctors barked orders, their voices sharp with the desperation of men fighting a losing battle against the clock. Cords snapped taut, and the heavy thud of a crash cart hitting the floor echoed like a drumbeat of war. In the center of it all lay Jackson Thorne, a man who had survived the most dangerous corners of the world, now undone by a training exercise gone horribly wrong. His uniform was a shredded mess of Kevlar and blood, the jagged signature of a grenade malfunction written across his ribs in deep, violent gashes. But even as the medical team swarmed him, one presence remained immovable. Havoc, the K9, sat pinned to the floor at the foot of the bed. His eyes didn't blink. They were locked on Thorne's face, tracking every shallow breath, every flicker of the monitor. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a silent sentinel, a living bridge between the world of the living and the darkness Thorne was drifting toward. Elena stood against the cold hospital wall, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. To the passing nurses, she was just a rookie, a face they barely recognized. But to anyone who knew how to look, truly look, her posture was too precise. She didn't have the frantic energy of the other staff. She had the stillness of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Her eyes never left the table. BP is bottoming out, a nurse shouted. We're losing his pulse. The lead surgeon, a man named Dr. Sterling, gritted his teeth as he worked the suction. He's got shrapnel near the femoral, but there's something else. I can't find the primary bleed. Suddenly, Havoc let out a soft, sharp whine. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was a warning. The dog leaned forward, his nose twitching, his gaze shifting from Thorne's face to his lower left side. Elena's eyes sharpened instantly. She stepped out of the shadows, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Left side, she said, her tone absolute. He's bleeding internally. Retroperitoneal, you're missing the pocket. Sterling snapped his head around, eyes wide with irritation and shock. Who told you to? Now, Elena insisted, her voice dropping into a register of command that made the room freeze. You're missing it. He's got 30 seconds before he's gone. Sterling hesitated for a heartbeat, then looked at the K9, who was now pouring urgently at the gurney. He shifted his focus. He moved the retractors. Jesus, someone whispered. There it was, a hidden rupture, masked by the surface trauma. If they had waited another minute, Thorne would have bled out on the table. The room went quieter after that. The surgeons worked with a newfound, eerie focus. They saved him, but barely. As the last suture went in, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Sterling stepped back, his gloves slick with Thorne's blood. He looked at Elena, his brow furrowed in deep suspicion. What did you say to that dog earlier? He demanded, his voice echoing in the sterile room. And how did you know exactly where that bleed was? Elena didn't look at him. She was watching Havoc lick Thorne's limp hand. Something they don't teach in colleges, she answered quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets. Before Sterling could press her further, the ground began to tremble. It started as a low hum, a vibration that rattled the glass vials on the counters and made the fluorescent lights flicker. What the hell is that? A tech asked, looking at the ceiling. That's a helicopter, the charge nurse whispered, her eyes widening as the thudding of rotor blades grew louder, closer, more aggressive. This wasn't a standard medical transport. This was heavy steel. This was military. A security guard rushed in, face pale, Roof access just lit up. It's a Navy bird. They didn't even ask for clearance. Elena's jaw tightened. She knew that specific rhythm, the heavy, rhythmic beat of a Seahawk coming in hot. It was a sound she had buried in the sands of the Persian Gulf years ago. Somewhere above them, steel touched concrete with a bone-jarring thud. Havoc lifted his head. He didn't growl this time. He let out a low, steady bark, a bark of recognition. He knew who was on that roof, and Elena knew that her life as a rookie nurse had just ended. The past wasn't just knocking on the door, it was crashing through the roof. The thrumming of the helicopter blades above wasn't just a sound, it was a physical weight that pressed down on the entire hospital. Windows rattled in their frames, and the morning staff, people who lived their lives by the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft squeak of rubber soles, looked up in terror. But Elena didn't look up. She knew exactly what was happening. The elevator doors at the end of the long, sterile corridor slid open with a sharp, mechanical hiss. 4 men stepped out. They didn't run, they didn't shout. They moved with the quiet, terrifying certainty of men who own the ground they walked on. No insignia graced their dark jackets, but their posture was unmistakable. The rigid shoulders, the scanning eyes, the hands that rested habitually near their waists. The lead surgeon, Dr. Sterling, stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "This is a restricted area," he shouted, his voice cracking against the silence the men brought with them. The tallest man in the group didn't even slow down. He swept the hallway with a single, professional gaze, taking in the blood-streaked floor and the armed security guards who were suddenly realizing their small-town pistols were no match for the energy in the room. Then, his eyes landed on the K-9. Havoc was sitting outside the recovery room, his body perfectly aligned with the door, his ears forward. He didn't growl, he didn't move, he simply watched. The man stopped dead in his tracks. For the first time, his mask of military indifference cracked. "Where is she?" the man asked, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "Where's who?" Sterling stammered. "The nurse," the man replied, his eyes narrowing. "The one who spoke to the dog." A heavy silence fell over the corridor. Elena was standing near the nurse's station, half shrouded in the dim morning shadows, finishing a chart she had already completed 3 times. She had felt the shift the moment they entered the building. It was the change in air pressure that happens when the past finally catches up to the present. The charge nurse, trembling, pointed a finger. "Her." The man turned. He walked toward Elena, his boots clicking rhythmically on the tile. Anyone else would have seen a rookie nurse in wrinkled scrubs, but this man, Commander Miller, saw something else. He saw the slight tightening of her jaw. He saw the way her feet were planted, ready to pivot. He saw the ghost of the deadliest operator he had ever known. He stopped inches from her. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared, searching her face for the woman he had buried in a desert grave years ago. Then, slowly, and with agonizing deliberation, Miller straightened his spine. He brought his hand up in a full, hard, razor-sharp Navy SEAL salute. Every conversation in that hallway died instantly. Doctors froze with needles in midair. Security guards lowered their weapons in confusion. A rookie nurse was being saluted by a high-ranking commander of the world's most elite fighting force. Elena closed her eyes for a single second, letting the weight of her old life settle back onto her shoulders. When she opened them, the rookie nurse was gone. In her place stood a veteran. "Commander," she said quietly, returning the salute without a flicker of hesitation. Miller lowered his hand, his face unusually pale. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I didn't know you were alive." "Neither did most of the world," Elena replied. Without a word, they moved to a small consultation room. No one stopped them. No one dared to ask for their ID. Havoc followed them to the door and sat, his eyes never leaving Elena until the frame blocked his view. Inside, the room was too bright, too clinical. Miller removed his jacket and placed it over a chair like he was preparing for a briefing, not a reunion with a dead woman. "How long?" he asked, his voice tight. Elena sat down, her movements fluid and efficient. "Long enough." Miller shook his head slowly. "You were declared KIA, Gulf War Night ambush. The report said the entire unit was wiped out. No survivors. I know, Elena said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. I was there. We pulled what we could from the site, Miller argued, leaning forward, his elbows on the table. Bodies, tags, equipment. We found nothing to suggest you made it out. You weren't supposed to find anything, Elena replied, meeting his eyes with a cold, piercing intensity. The commander exhaled, a ragged sound. That dog, Havoc, the code you used. It's a unit recall phrase, a conditioned response that hasn't been used in decades. It tells the K9 his handler is safe and command authority is present, Elena explained calmly. That phrase was retired, Elena, Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It was retired after your unit, after the disaster. After my team was slaughtered, Elena finished for him. Miller leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. The seal on that table, Jackson Thorne, he was injured in a training exercise, a live simulation gone wrong, shrapnel ricocheted. He shouldn't have survived the flight here. He wouldn't have, Elena said, but that dog is the reason he's breathing. He kept him conscious. And you're the reason that dog didn't tear my security team's throats out, Miller countered. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the stethoscope around her neck and the blue scrubs. How did you survive the blast, Elena, and why did you disappear? Elena leaned back. The room seemed to dim as she began to speak, her voice taking Miller back to a desert perimeter with no moon and no air cover. We were ghosts, she whispered. The top classified unit. No names, no records. 1/3 of the confirmed kills in that sector were mine alone. She told him about the compound that should have been empty, but was filled with perfect angles and perfect timing. An ambush. I was thrown clear by the blast, she said, her hands clenching briefly before relaxing into forced stillness. When I woke up, everything was on fire. My team, they were gone, all of them. And you, Miller asked. I was injured enough to look like a corpse, Elena said. I crawled, I hid. I stayed still for hours until the extraction teams swept the area. I watched them pick up the tags of my friends and leave me behind. Why didn't you call out? Elena's gaze hardened into flint. Because someone wanted my unit erased, Miller, not just killed, forgotten. If I had stood up, I wouldn't have been rescued. I would have been finished off. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. You think it was an inside job, Miller said, though it wasn't really a question. I know it was, Elena replied, and I know that the man who helped me vanish, the Admiral, he knew it too. The silence in the consultation room was a living thing, heavy, thick, and suffocating. Elena sat across from Commander Miller, her face a mask of iron, but her mind was a battlefield of memories. The sterile white walls of the hospital felt like they were closing in, a stark contrast to the vast, burning desert she had left behind years ago. The Admiral, Miller whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. He was the one who helped you vanish. Elena nodded once, a sharp, precise movement. He gave me a choice, she said, her voice like cold gravel. I could have stayed and faced a trial that would have ended with a bullet in a dark alley, or I could take a clean slate and a new life. I chose to live as a human, not a weapon. Miller rubbed his face, the exhaustion of 100 missions etched into the lines around his eyes. And you became a nurse. You traded the rifle for a stethoscope. I learned how to save lives instead of taking them, Elena replied quietly. I thought I could bring balance to my soul. I thought the ghosts would stay in the sand. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. A young medic peeked in, his face pale and eyes darting nervously toward the commander. Sir, the SEAL, Jackson Thorne, he's out of surgery. He's stable, but the dog, the K9 hasn't moved an inch. Elena stood immediately, her old instincts overriding her civilian training. She walked back into the corridor, Miller trailing behind her like a shadow. Outside the recovery room, Havoc remained a silent, furry gargle. The moment he saw Elena, the dog stood and pressed his forehead gently against her thigh. It wasn't a submissive gesture, it was a recognition of command. He recognizes you, Miller murmured, stunned. He recognizes loss, Elena corrected. But as the morning sun began to bleed through the ICU windows, the atmosphere changed. The hospital was waking up, but a new kind of darkness was filtering in with the light. Elena felt it first, that prickle on the back of her neck that told her she was being watched. "Commander," Elena said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "look at the end of the hall." A man stood near the administrative desk. He wore a dark civilian coat, his back to them, appearing perfectly ordinary. But he was too still. He didn't have a coffee cup. He didn't have a clipboard. He was scanning the room with the predatory efficiency of a hunter. Miller's hand drifted toward his side, though he was unarmed. "Who is that?" The man turned. He had a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes that were fixed directly on Elena. He began to walk toward them, his movements slow and deliberate. "I thought I'd find you here," the man said, his voice smooth and oily. Miller stepped in front of Elena, his voice hardening into a command. "Identify yourself. This is a secure military recovery zone." The man pulled a badge halfway from his pocket, just enough to show a glint of gold and a black seal, but not enough to read the name. "Oversight," he said simply. Elena laughed, a short, humorless sound. "That's not a title, that's a cover." "It's a title when you don't want fingerprints," the man replied, his gaze sliding past Miller to lock onto Elena. "We've been tracking anomalies, Elena, dogs responding to dead codes, nurses performing procedures they shouldn't even know exist." He looked her up and down with a chilling clinicality. "You slipped. You exposed yourself." "I saved a life," Elena shot back, her voice ringing with a defiance that made the nearby nurses jump. "You became a liability," the man countered. "Your existence alone contradicts multiple sealed reports that important people worked very hard to finalize." The tension in the hallway was a live wire, ready to snap. Security guards hovered, sensing the shift, but unsure who to follow. Havoc's low growl returned, a rumble that vibrated through Elena's boots. "You're not here for answers," Elena said, her eyes narrowing. "You're here to see if I'm a threat that needs to be neutralized again." The oversight man's smile faded. "The world is a quieter place when ghosts stay in their grave, Elena." Suddenly, an alarm blared from inside the ICU. It wasn't a technical failure, it was a medical emergency. "Code Blue, Room 4, a nurse screamed. Jackson Thorne was seizing. His vitals had spiked into the red. But as the doctors rushed toward him, Havoc lunged forward, blocking the door with his massive frame, his teeth bared not at the doctors, but at the oversight man. "He's waking up," a doctor shouted through the glass. "He's disoriented. We need to sedate him." Elena didn't hesitate. She pushed past the oversight man and the commander, dropping to her knees by the bed. Thorne's eyes flew open, wide, bloodshot, and frantic. He reached out, his hand shaking, grabbing Elena's arm with a strength that spoke of pure survival. His lips parted, struggling against the oxygen mask. "Elena," he rasped, the name landing like a bomb in the middle of the room. The oversight man froze. Miller's jaw dropped. The man on the bed didn't just know her code. He knew her name, and he knew it from the night the world thought she died. Elena looked at Thorne, then back at the oversight man standing in the doorway. She realized with a cold, terrifying certainty that the secret she had kept for years was no longer hers to keep. The war hadn't just followed her home, it was standing in the room, waiting for her to blink. The room felt like it was shrinking the moment Jackson Thorne whispered that name. Elena. It wasn't just a word, it was a detonation that leveled the carefully constructed walls of her hidden life. The heart monitor's steady beep 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 suddenly accelerated into a frantic scream, mirroring the rising pulse of everyone in the room. Havoc rose fully onto his feet, his massive frame positioning itself like a shield between the bed and the man in the dark coat. The low, rhythmic growl that rolled out of the dog's chest was no longer a warning to strangers, it was a recognition of an ancient enemy. Elena didn't turn around to face the threat behind her, not yet. She stepped closer to the bed, her movements fluid and calm despite the chaos. She placed one hand firmly on Thorne's trembling shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You're safe," she whispered, her voice a cool blade of logic cutting through his sedation-induced fog. "You're in a hospital, don't move." Thorne's eyes struggled to focus, shifting between the ceiling and the woman standing over him. Pain flickered across his features, but beneath it, a sharp, military awareness began to cut through the haze of drugs. "You came back," he rasped, his voice raw. Elena shook her head slightly, a shadow of a smile touching her lips. "No, Jackson, you did." Commander Miller moved with lightning speed. "Sedation team, now, keep him calm before he rips his sutures." "No," Elena said. The word wasn't a request, it was an order. Miller hesitated, his authority momentarily paralyzed by the sheer weight of her conviction. "He's oriented enough," Elena continued, her voice never rising but filling the room. "If you sedate him hard right now, his blood pressure will crater and you risk the internal bleed restarting. Let him wake up." The lead surgeon checked the monitors, his eyes wide as he looked at the data, then back at the nurse who was outthinking his entire staff. He nodded reluctantly. "She's right, keep him steady." Behind them, the oversight man shifted his weight, his thin smile replaced by a look of clinical irritation. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. That was when Elena finally turned. She didn't just look at him, she looked through him. For the first time since he had stepped off that elevator, the man's supreme confidence seemed to crack. He saw the operator behind the eyes of the nurse. "You shouldn't be here," Elena said, her voice dropping into a register that made the air feel cold. "And you know it." "You don't get to decide that," he replied, though the bravado felt hollow. "I already did," Elena said, "a long time ago." Havoc took a single, heavy step toward the man. The oversight man went silent, his eyes darting toward the dog's bared teeth. Thorne groaned softly on the bed, his hand twitching weakly until his fingers brushed against Havoc's fur. The K9 leaned in instantly, pressing his head against the soldier's chest. "Good boy," Thorne murmured, "didn't leave me." Elena swallowed hard, a flicker of emotion breaking through her iron mask. "No," she whispered, "he didn't." Commander Miller stepped into the center of the room, his gaze alternating between Elena and the wounded SEAL. "You recognized her," he said to Thorne. "From where?" Thorne's brow furrowed as he fought to pull the memory from the depths of his mind. "Desert Night Op, years ago," he breathed, his breathing shallow and rhythmic. "I was attached to a different team. We saw her unit once. They moved like ghosts." The oversight man stiffened, his hand twitching near his pocket. "You shouldn't remember that," he snapped. "That mission was scrubbed from the record." Thorne's eyes sharpened, the fire of a warrior returning to his gaze. "I remember, because they saved us. They stayed when the air cover pulled out." A beat of silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Elena felt something in her chest loosen, a weight she hadn't known she was carrying for a decade. Miller turned slowly toward the oversight man, his expression darkening into a mask of pure fury. "You told us there were no witnesses to that unit's final stand. You told the board there was no one left to verify the betrayal." The oversight man's jaw tightened. Memories fade under stress. His testimony is unreliable. "Apparently not," Miller replied, his voice a low growl. The man from oversight exhaled, his mind clearly spinning through a dozen different ways to bury the truth once again. "This doesn't change the facts. She is still a liability to the agency. Her existence alone contradicts multiple sealed reports. Do you have any idea the chaos this will cause?" Elena stepped forward, her shadow falling over the man. "Then unseal them," she said. "You think that ends well for you," he shot back. "For the Navy, for everyone involved." "I think I've lived long enough pretending I don't exist," Elena said, her voice ringing with an authority that silenced the entire ICU. Miller broke the tension. "This ends now. You don't have the authority to call off an oversight investigation, Commander," the man spat. Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen twice with a grim finality. "I do," he said, "as of 5 minutes ago." The oversight man's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, and as he read the message, the color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost himself. "You went over my head," he whispered. "I went to the only person who still remembers what that unit did," Miller replied, his voice steady, "and the only one who didn't sign off on erasing them." The man's lips parted, then closed. He looked at Alina, then at the K9, and finally at the wounded SEAL. He knew when he was outmatched. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. "This isn't finished." Alina met his eyes without flinching. "It is for me." He turned and walked out of the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hall until they were swallowed by the sounds of the morning hospital. The hospital seemed to exhale. The tension that had held the room in a vice grip for hours finally snapped. Jackson Thorne drifted back into a natural sleep, his vitals steady and his hand still resting on the K9's head. Havoc curled up beside the bed, one paw touching the metal frame, satisfied that his watch was over for now. Miller watched Alina for a long moment, the respect in his eyes clear. "They'll never fully admit what you were," he said softly, "or what your unit did for this country." "I don't need them to," Alina replied. "They offered to reinstate you," Miller continued. "A command advisory role, training the next generation of K9 handlers. You'd have full protection." Alina looked at Thorne, at the dog who had refused to leave his side, and at the ordinary hospital room filled with extraordinary consequences. She shook her head gently. "I'm done leading people into the dark," she said. "You're sure?" "I chose this life," Alina said, looking out the window at the rising sun, "and I'll keep choosing it." Miller nodded, snapping a sharp salute one last time. "Then the record stays sealed. Let the ghosts rest." The morning sun finally crested over the Chicago skyline, bleeding amber light through the tall glass windows of the ICU. In the sterile corridors of Chicago General, the frantic energy of the night had been replaced by a heavy, ringing silence. To the rest of the world, it was just another shift change. But for the staff of Ward 4, the world had shifted on its axis. Alina stood at the central nurses' station, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she sorted through patient files. On the outside, she was the same rookie nurse who had started her shift 12 hours ago. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair was tied back in a messy knot, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But as the day shift arrived, the air around her felt different. The surgeons who usually walked past her without a glance now lingered. Dr. Sterling, the man who had tried to throw her out of the trauma bay, stood 10 feet away, a cup of lukewarm coffee forgotten in his hand. He wasn't looking at the charts. He was looking at her with a mixture of bewilderment and a new, unsettling kind of respect. He finally walked over, his footsteps hesitant. "The SEAL's vitals are holding," he said, his voice lacking its usual bite. "The internal bleed didn't just stop. The repair we did, it's holding better than expected, because of that pocket you found." Alina didn't look up from her screen. "He's a fighter, doctor. His body wants to live." "That's not what I mean," Sterling persisted, lowering his voice. "The commander, the salute, the dog, who are you, Alina?" Alina finally looked up. Her eyes weren't the eyes of a rookie. They were deep, ancient wells of experience that made the seasoned surgeon take a half step back. "I'm the person who's going to finish these charts so the next shift doesn't have to," she said quietly, "nothing more." Sterling opened his mouth to argue, but the look in her eyes told him the conversation was over. He nodded slowly and walked away, feeling like he had just tried to interrogate a thunderstorm. Inside room 412, the atmosphere was different. The blinds were partially closed, casting long, barred shadows across the floor. Jackson Thorne was awake now, though his body was a map of pain. He lay perfectly still, his breathing synchronized with the steady hiss-click of the ventilator beside him. At the foot of the bed, Havoc remained. The K9 hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, and hadn't moved. His chin was rested on the edge of the mattress, his dark eyes fixed on Thorne's face. Every time Thorne moved a finger, the dog's ears flickered. Alina entered the room quietly. She didn't need to check the monitors to know Thorne was watching her. "You should be resting," she said, her voice a soft anchor in the quiet room. Hard to sleep when you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, Thorn rasped. He reached out a trembling hand, and Havoc immediately nudged it with his wet nose. That man, from oversight, he's gone. He's gone, Elena confirmed, checking the IV line. Commander Miller saw to it. You're under military protection now. Nobody touches you without a high-level clearance. Thorn let out a breath that was half sigh, half groan. And you, are you protected? Elena paused, her hand resting on the railing of the bed. She looked out the window at the city waking up, the buses, the commuters, the thousands of people living lives completely unaware of the shadow wars fought in their name. I've been a ghost for 10 years, Jackson, she said. I know how to disappear in plain sight. You shouldn't have to, Thorn said, his voice gaining a shred of strength. What you did back then, saving my team when the brass pulled the plug, we never forgot. We didn't know the name of the unit, but we knew the legend. Elena turned back to him, and for a fleeting second, the iron mask slipped. A flash of grief, sharp and raw, crossed her face before she pulled it back. The legend died in the sand with my brothers, she said. I'm just the one who got stuck with the bill. Miller told me they offered you a way back in, Thorn said. They offered me a cage with a different name, Elena replied. I spent half my life being a weapon. I'd like to spend the rest of it being a human being. She reached down and scratched Havoc behind the ears. The dog leaned into her touch, his tail thumping once against the linoleum floor. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated loyalty. He needs to eat, Elena said, changing the subject. And you need to sleep. That's an order from your nurse, not your superior. Thorn managed a weak, pained smile. Yes, ma'am. As Elena walked out of the room, she felt the weight of the silence again. But it wasn't the heavy silence of the battlefield. It was something else. It was the silence of a debt being paid. She had saved him twice now, once in a desert he barely remembered, and once in a hallway he would never forget. She walked back to the nurse's station, but as she reached for her pen, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Sitting on the counter was a small, plain manila envelope. No name, no return address, just a single, stamped seal on the back, the same gold glint she had seen on the oversight man's badge. She picked it up. Her hands didn't shake, but her breathing went shallow. She opened the seal and slid out a single piece of paper. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a subpoena. It was a photograph. It was a grainy, long-distance shot of a small house in the suburbs of Virginia, a house she hadn't seen in a decade. A house where an elderly woman was currently watering flowers on a porch. Beneath the photo, a single line was typed in black ink. Ghosts have families, Elena, even the ones who don't exist. The air in the hospital suddenly felt very, very cold. The photograph felt like it was burning through Elena's gloves. 10:00 a.m., the hospital was bustling with the sounds of recovery, but for Elena, the world had gone deathly silent. She stood in the center of the nursing station, the grainy image of her mother's house in Virginia clutched in her hand. They hadn't just found her. They had reached out and touched the one thing she had left in this world that was untainted by blood and betrayal. The message was clear. We can find you anywhere. We can hurt anyone. Elena didn't panic. Panic was for civilians. For someone trained in the darkest corners of the earth, panic was a luxury that got people killed. Instead, she felt a cold, familiar clarity settle over her. The nurse was gone. The ghost was being forced back into the light. She didn't call the police. She didn't call hospital security. She turned and walked toward the one room that was currently the safest place in the building. Room 412. Havoc was alert the moment she crossed the threshold. The K9 stood up, his tail low, his eyes scanning Elena's face. He sensed the shift in her chemistry, the spike in cortisol, the sharpening of her focus. He let out a soft, questioning huff. Jackson Thorn was propped up on his pillows, his face still pale but his eyes clear. He saw the photograph in her hand and the look in her eyes. "Elena," he asked, his voice rasping, "what happened?" "The shadow moved," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She handed him the photo. Thorn looked at it, his jaw tightening until the muscle pulsed in his cheek. Oversight, they're threatening a civilian. They're threatening my mother, Elena corrected. They want me to stay dead. They want to make sure I never speak about the unit, never testify, and never exist again. What are you going to do? Thorne asked. Elena leaned over the bed, her voice dropping into a whisper that not even the room's microphones could catch. I'm going to do what we were trained to do when we were cornered. I'm going to stop running and start hunting. She turned to the K9. Havoc, watch him. Do not let anyone in this room except Miller. Understood. The dog let out a sharp, single bark. It was a soldier's promise. Elena walked out of the room, but she didn't head for the exit. She headed for the hospital's basement, the labyrinth of steam pipes, electrical grids, and old records where the cameras didn't reach. She reached into her locker and pulled out a small, waterproof bag she had kept hidden behind a false panel for 3 years. Inside wasn't a gun. It was an encrypted satellite phone and a small, black USB drive, the insurance policy she had stolen from the Admiral the night she died. She dialed a number that didn't exist in any directory. I know you're listening, Elena said into the receiver once the line clicked. You're making a mistake, Elena, a voice replied, the smooth, oily voice of the oversight man. You had a good life here. You were helping people. Why throw it away for a mother who thinks you've been dead for a decade? Because you broke the rules, Elena said, her voice like cracking ice. You don't target family, not ever. We do whatever is necessary to protect the integrity of the state, the man replied. That USB drive, it's a fantasy. You have nothing. Then why are you still on the line? Elena countered. I'm giving you 1 hour. Pull your teams back from Virginia. Delete the surveillance. If I don't get a confirmation signal in 60 minutes, I'm not going to the press. I'm going to the Kremlin. I'm going to Beijing. I will burn every deep cover asset you have on 3 continents. You wouldn't, the man whispered, his voice finally losing its composure. That's treason. I'm a ghost, Elena whispered back. Ghosts don't have countries, they only have memories. She hung up. She stood in the dim light of the basement, the hum of the hospital's boilers the only sound. She was counting the seconds. She knew how they worked. They would try to trace the call. They would try to send a team to the basement. But Elena wasn't there anymore. By the time the oversight recovery team burst into the basement 5 minutes later, they found nothing but an empty satellite phone and a note taped to a steam pipe. It read, "Check your own servers." High above them, in the ICU, Commander Miller was receiving a frantic call from the Pentagon. The untraceable oversight servers were being systematically dismantled by a virus that had been dormant for 10 years, a virus named the Ghost Protocol. Elena sat in the hospital cafeteria, calmly drinking a cup of tea, watching the news on the wall. She looked like just another tired nurse on her break, but under the table, her hand was steady. She saw the oversight man walk through the lobby, his face white, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked around frantically, searching for the woman who had just brought his entire world to its knees. He looked right at her. Elena lifted her teacup in a silent, mocking toast. He didn't move, he couldn't. He realized in that moment that he hadn't been hunting a nurse. He had been poking a sleeping dragon. Miller walked up to the oversight man, 2 military police officers at his side. He didn't say a word. He just pointed toward the door. The man was stripped of his badge and escorted out into the bright Chicago morning, his career and his life of shadows over. Elena finished her tea and stood up. She walked back to room 412. Thorne looked up as she entered. Is it done? The shadow is gone, Elena said. They won't be coming back, not for me, not for you. And your mother. She's watering her flowers, Elena said, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. She has no idea how close she came to losing a daughter she already lost. Thorne reached out and took her hand. What happens now, Elena, for the legendary nurse of Ward 4? Elena looked at Havoc, who was now resting his head on her lap. She looked at the hospital she had called home. Now, she said softly, I think I'll just be Alina, and maybe that's finally enough. The storm had passed, but the air in Chicago General still felt charged, like the atmosphere after a lightning strike. The morning shift was in full swing. Trays rattled, pages beeped, and the sun climbed higher, casting long, golden fingers through the glass. To the world outside, it was just another Tuesday. But inside room 412, a chapter of history was being written in silence. Jackson Thorne sat up, the heavy bandages around his chest, a stark reminder of how close he had come to the abyss. Beside him, Havoc remained a steadfast shadow, his head resting on the edge of the bed. The K9 was finally at peace, his ears no longer pinned back, his eyes no longer searching for an invisible enemy. He knew the war was over. The door creaked open, and Commander Miller stepped in. He wasn't wearing his tactical gear anymore. He wore his dress whites, stiff, blindingly bright, and adorned with the medals of a man who had seen too much. He looked at Thorne, then turned his gaze to Alina, who was quietly adjusting the monitors. The transport is ready, Miller said, his voice echoing with a deep, somber authority. Thorne is being moved to a private naval facility for recovery, top-tier security, no oversight, no ghosts. Thorne looked at Alina, his hand finding Havoc's ears. And what about her, Commander? What happens to the woman who doesn't exist? Miller stepped toward Alina, pulling a small, velvet-lined box from his pocket. He placed it on the bedside table. Inside sat a silver star, the third highest military decoration for valor. It had no name engraved on the back. It didn't need one. The Pentagon wants to make this official, Miller said. A full reinstatement, your rank restored, your back pay settled. They want you to lead the new K9 Tactical Division at Great Lakes. You'd be the highest-ranking handler in the history of the Navy. Alina looked at the medal. The silver glinted in the morning light, reflecting the years of blood, sand, and secrets she had endured. For a moment, the room was so quiet you could hear the heartbeat of the hospital. She reached out, but she didn't pick up the medal. She closed the box with a soft, final click. Commander, Alina said, her voice steady and filled with a quiet power. I spent 10 years being a number. I spent 10 years waiting for orders. I'm not that person anymore. Miller's brow furrowed. Alina, you're a hero. You can't just stay a rookie nurse in a public hospital. You're overqualified for the world. Alina smiled, a real, weary but beautiful smile. I'm not a rookie, Commander. I'm the best nurse this ward has. And here, when someone's heart stops, I don't ask what their clearance is. I just save them. That's the only life I want. Thorne leaned forward, his voice thick with emotion. You're staying. I'm staying, Alina whispered. My mother is safe. My secrets are buried. And for the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am when I wake up in the morning. Miller stood at attention. He didn't argue. He knew a soldier's heart when he saw one. He snapped a sharp, final salute, not to a ghost, but to a woman who had finally found her home. Then the record stays sealed. Godspeed, Alina. As the transport team arrived to move Thorne, the K9 refused to move until Alina knelt one last time. She leaned into Havoc's ear and whispered a new code, not a command for war, but a blessing for peace. The dog licked her hand, a final thank you from a beast that remembered everything. Hours later, the hospital returned to its routine. Alina stood at the nurse's station, charting vitals for a new patient, a grandmother with a broken hip. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. But as she walked past the window, she saw a black SUV pull away from the curb. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was the charge nurse. Long night, rookie, you okay? Alina looked at the empty space where the Navy transport had been. She felt the weight of the stethoscope around her neck, her new weapon of choice. I'm better than okay, Alina said. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. She turned back to her charts. She didn't need the headlines. She didn't need the medals. She had saved a life, protected her family, and defeated a shadow empire all before her coffee got cold. And in the quiet halls of Chicago General, that was more than enough. Because some heroes don't wear capes, some don't even wear uniforms. They wear blue scrubs, they work the midnight shift, and they carry secrets that would break a lesser soul. They are the guardians in the dark, and they are everywhere. If this story moved you, if you felt the loyalty of a dog that never forgets and the courage of a woman who chose peace over power, then you are the reason these stories are told. Don't let this hero be forgotten. Hit that subscribe button right now. Comment loyalty if you believe a K9 is more than just a pet. These stories survive because of you. Stay tuned because the next mission is already beginning. And remember, some ghosts never truly die, they just start saving lives.